Today, we're going to be looking at a poem again in Portuguese. And I'll open up a few minutes at the end so you can ask questions if you want about learning Portuguese as a language at Oxford as well. But basically, the outline of today's session is that we're going to read a poem. I'm going to read it out in Portuguese. If any of you would like to read the English translation, please feel free to do so. I will open up space for that. We're going to do a little bit of a close reading of the poem together. And if you'd like to speak up or write your comments in the chat, that's absolutely fine. And then we're going to think about placing that poem and reconsidering our initial close reading in light of the context. And one of the things that's interesting about learning Portuguese at university is that it might be a context to the context of Brazilian literature, the context of Portuguese literature, of Angolan or Mozambican literatures, might not be a context that you are familiar with. So there is a lot of kind of putting literature and history and sociology together to make sense of the works that you're going to be reading. So this is what we're going to start with. We're going to be reading a poem called Não Há Vagas by Brazilian poet Ferreira Goulart. Here we have the Portuguese and we have the English translation. I'll read it out in Portuguese so you can have a feel for the language, because sometimes people think, oh, it's very similar to Spanish. Sometimes people think it sounds very similar to Russian. So I'll read it out and you can make your own judgments. So, não há vagas. Start thinking about the language that is being used in the poem, if there are any repetitions, and start making a note of that so we can talk about it. So, não há vagas. O preço do feijão não cabe no poema. O preço do arroz não cabe no poema. Não cabem no poema o gás, a luz, o telefone, a sonegação do leite, da carne, do açúcar, do pão. O funcionário público não cabe no poema, com seu salário de fome, sua vida fechada em arquivos. Como não cabe no poema o operário, que esmerila seu dia de aço e carvão nas oficinas escuras. Porque o poema, senhores, está fechado. Não há vagas. Só cabe no poema o homem sem estômago, a mulher de nuvens, a fruta sem preço. O poema, senhores, não fede nem cheira. That's the Portuguese version. Would anybody be willing to read it out in English?
Yeah, of course, no problem. No vacancies. The price of beans doesn't fit the poem. The price of rice doesn't fit the poem. They do not fit the poem, the gas, the light, the telephone bills, the embezzlement of milk, of meat, of sugar, of bread. The civil servant doesn't fit the poem, with his poverty wage, his life filed away, much like the factory worker doesn't fit the poem, who grinds down his days of coal and steel in dark workshops. Because the poem, ladies and gentlemen, is closed. No vacancies. What fits the poem are the man with no hunger, the woman in the clouds, the fruit with no price tag. The poem, ladies and gentlemen, is neither here nor there.
Thank you so much, Madeline. One of the first things that I wanted to ask you is, what are the kind of things that jump out at you in terms of either themes, in terms of either language? Do you notice any sort of repetition? Is the structure of the poem particularly interesting? And feel free to use the chat function to make any comments. So we have a comment here. The way the poem is structured on the page is enjambment. Yes, we don't have very kind of clear lines that end and then we start a new one. We have the sense of the lines flowing into one another. Absolutely. What else about the structure of the poem? We have a few different stanzas, right? We have maybe 4 stanzas, some a bit longer than the others. Is there anything that you find particularly significant or particular to the first stanza of the poem? So this first section of the poem, from the price of beans to of bread. So we have the listing of food. Yes, absolutely. We have a repetition here of the price of beans, the price of rice. And then we have the embezzlement of milk, of meat, of sugar, of bread. So the price of beans doesn't fit the poem, and then the price of rice doesn't fit the poem. We have a sense of repetition here, not only in the sense of the listing of the food, right? And we have the same structure, again, to the syntax, to the way the sentences are put together. So the price of beans doesn't fit the poem. The price of rice doesn't fit the poem. They do not fit the poem. And then we have, again, the listing, the gas, the light, the telephone bills, of meat, of milk, of meat, of sugar, and of bread. What does this repetition do? Does it do anything to you as readers? Highlights the inequality. In what way? So what kind of inequality? Perhaps like an economic, the corruption possibly, the price of food being extortionate. Absolutely. And these are very kind of staple items. We don't have luxury items here. We have beans, we have rice, we have milk, meat, sugar, and bread. So he highlights the frustration. The list goes on and on. Absolutely. And it's significant that these are kind of staple items as well. So the most basic things that we would like to have. So beans and rice are kind of the staple foods here in Brazil. Milk, meat, sugar, and bread. And also the bills, right? Everything is extortionate. Everything in terms of kind of perhaps the inflation, perhaps the corruption, all of the things make it impossible for ordinary people to purchase the most basic items that they need. In the second stanza, we have a slightly different structure. We have the civil servant doesn't fit the poem. We have a different element here. Instead of having the bills or these kind of food items, we have the civil servant, which in Brazil receives what Ferreira Goulart calls a poverty wage, his life filed away. Again, the factory worker, much like the civil servant, doesn't fit the poem. So again, we have these sorts of figures of workers that don't kind of fit the poem, and who grinds down his days of coal and steel in dark workshops. So again, we have different kinds of elements, but similarly, they don't have this space in the poem. And this leads me to another question. What does this expression "doesn't fit the poem" mean to you? Does it have more than one meaning? Perhaps another way of thinking about the question is, what are the different meanings that we can derive from this expression "doesn't fit the poem"? So is the poem a euphemism of the world and what it has come to? So it's quite interesting, right? Because at the same time, this idea of the euphemism of saying something without saying it, or saying something that kind of stands for something else in a different way, we have a sense here of a list of things that don't fit the poem, right? They don't fit the poem, physically. They don't have space in the poem, in the words that compose a poem, but also in the sense of kind of almost a morality, right? They aren't materials for poetry. So, right, the price of beans isn't a proper material for poetry. At the same time, the poem itself is about the price of beans, right? In the way it says that the price of beans doesn't fit the poem, the corruption, the prices of food being extortionate, the frustration that comes with that, all of these things are consequently in the poem. So there is a kind of maybe an irony here, maybe something that's being subverted in the poem. When the civil servant doesn't fit the poem, the civil servant is still being named and his poverty wage is still being named in the poem. The factory worker is fitting in the poem. The factory worker is in the poem, even though maybe at this time, the factory worker wasn't an appropriate subject for poetry, right? And this takes us to the third stanza, because the poem, ladies and gentlemen, is closed, no vacancies. What fits the poem are the man with no hunger, the woman in the clouds, the fruit with no price tag. So what are the kinds of subjects that do fit the poem? So what would you extract from these three examples here? The man with no hunger, the woman in the clouds, the fruit with no price tag. Are they different from the other elements named in the poem? So they're free to exist, absolutely. And if we think again about this question of what is an appropriate subject for poetry? So perhaps the rising price of beans, the extortionate price of beans, isn't an appropriate subject for poetry to tackle. At the same time, the man with no hunger, a man that doesn't have any worries, the man that's not suffering, he fits the poem. Poetry should be able to talk about the man with no hunger, but not the extortionate price of beans that might leave the man with hunger. So there's a tension here between these two elements. We have a woman in the clouds, perhaps a muse, perhaps an idealized woman, perhaps a woman with no worries. There are several meanings that we can think about here. The fruit with no price tag, right? The fruit that doesn't have an extortionate price, or that we can, it's free to exist as it is. That obviously is placed in contrast with the kind of the embezzlement of milk, of meat, of sugar, of bread, that really strange word embezzlement, which kind of almost means the stealing of, the kind of taking it away, the corruption that is implied here. Are there any other things that strike you as particular to the poem, or quite interesting in the sense of things that fit the poem, fit the poetry, are able to be spoken about in poetry, and things that shouldn't be spoken about in poetry? If not, perhaps we might, okay, we have a couple of things here. The lines are all different lengths. How can something fit, but there be no regulation? That's quite an interesting thing, right? There isn't a set place for something to fit. Maybe things have to be squeezed in these kinds of enjambed lines. So dreams, especially women who are able to have dreams and escape, absolutely. The ability to have dreams already implies, a level of freedom, a level of opportunities. The woman that is not in the clouds, the woman that is on the ground working as a factory worker, as a civil servant, the woman that has to, buy beans and deal with the extortionate prices, that woman perhaps doesn't fit the poem, is not an appropriate subject for poetry. So if we think about this from our initial kind of reading of it, in light of the context, I think it adds something really interesting to our interpretation, to all of the things that you have mentioned in the chat. So one of the things that I wanted to mention is the kind of context of publication. So this poem, Não há vagas, was published in 1975 in a collection called Dentro da Noite Veloz, which means something like Inside the Rapid Night. 1975 is a year that's set at the very height of a 21-year dictatorship that took place in Brazil. So here I have a little bit of information about the coup, right? The taking of power that happened in 1964. So in Brazil, you might not know, but there was a military coup in 1964 that took place and led to the overthrow of a democratically elected left-wing president called João Goulart. And that set the start of the Brazilian military dictatorship, which lasted 21 years. It only ended in 1985, 10 years after the publication of this poem. Particularly, the year in which this poem was published was one of the years that are referred to as the years of lead, os anos de chumbo. So they are the heaviest years of the military dictatorship. That was when we see the rise of the military's hard line. So the most extreme members of the military rose to power, and they put forward what is called the Institutional Act number 5 in 1968. And this institutional act, it was basically a change to the Constitution. And it meant that it allowed for the increase of the suspension of civil and political rights. So people's civil and political rights, like voting, was completely gotten rid of the right to protest was completely gotten rid of. This moment also saw the violence and repression increase. So when we say the institutionalization, it's kind of a very fancy word, is basically it became legal to unlawfully detain somebody. So if you were just walking around and somebody wanted to detain you for no reason whatsoever, they could. They didn't have to have a reason to arrest you. And censorship as well became something that was legal. So before anything could be published, they had to pass the censors. It also was the period that saw the establishment of agencies that were responsible for carrying out torture of people that opposed the dictatorship. It's also interesting to think that Ferreira Goulart, the poet that we're talking about, the poet that wrote Não há vagas, no vacancies, was a very politically active poet. And on the same day that the Institutional Act was passed in 1968, he was arrested. And after a small period of detention, he left for exile in 1971. And he only came back to Brazil in 1977 after being exiled in Argentina, in Chile, in the Soviet Union at the time. And it was during this period that he published some of his most important works, including this collection. So from outside of Brazil, he collected these poems and published as Dentro da Noite Veloz, Inside of the Rapid Night. When we think about this context, do we see the poem kind of change in meaning, or are we able to kind of refine, perhaps is a good word, are we able to refine our reading of it? How does it change when we think about the context in which this poem was written in? And if you have any impressions, do write them in the chat. I see Serafina has unmuted. Would you like to say something?
Despite the poem being like for everyone, like for men and women, the topics don't have that same freedom, so that it's like restricted for a certain demographic, despite being for everyone.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And tell me a little bit more about this idea of restriction. So if we're writing, or if we're thinking about writing that's done under censorship, under repression, what is this? How does this idea of restriction come in? So if we think about the fact that some things are able to be talked about in poetry and certain other things shouldn't be talked about in poetry. Obviously, here Ferreira Goulart is doing something a little bit funny because he is talking about those things that somehow, for some reason, don't have a place in poetry. He's still talking about them, even though he's saying they don't have a place in poetry. If we think about writing that's being done under a moment of repression, of political repression, of the suppression of civil and political rights, of censorship, there are several things that can't be talked about in poetry. Perhaps a denunciation of kind of torture, practices of torture here under the dictatorship. These are things that don't fit poetry, right? Perhaps what Ferreira Goulart is denouncing here, in fact, is not only the price of beans. He's denouncing definitely the price of beans for a huge part of the population. He's denouncing the price of rice, the price of the telephone bills. And in a situation where we can't actually go out and protest or complain about the price of rice, the price of beans, the price of gas, and poetry isn't a place where these things fit. Only the man with no hunger. There's almost like this idealized version of society, a version, of society that forgets about the man with hunger, the woman that isn't in the clowns, the woman that is in the everyday dealing with the price of beans and the price of rice, the fruit that does have a price tag. There's something quite interesting that he's doing here to denounce whilst saying what shouldn't be denounced. So there's a kind of a contradiction in the poem. when he says the poem, ladies and gentlemen, is neither here nor there, how do we interpret that in this context where taking a stance might be seen as reason enough to be arrested? So it plays with irony, as it is not for everyone. Absolutely. There is definitely a sense of some people are subjects for poetry, that there is perhaps a class of people, a certain type of people that are the appropriate kind of subjects for poetry. But maybe the majority of the population isn't seen by poetry or by whatever kind of establishment that is to be an appropriate subject for poetry. So we have here, possibly each food or listed item has a hidden meaning related to the dictatorship. So milk is like agriculture, sugar is slavery, telephone bills, foreign influence and communication. So yeah, it could be that all of these kind of staple items also speak to kind of broader contexts of the production of food, kind of slavery as well, something that things that couldn't be dealt with in literature, for example, as openly as it could have been before or after this period of dictatorship, things that would have otherwise kind of annoyed the people in power. So if we think, for example, about this expression, neither here nor there, and this is the kind of translation that I was able to find to the expression in Portuguese, não fede nem cheira. And if we do a literal translation of o poema, senhores, não fede nem cheira, it says, the poem, ladies and gentlemen, doesn't stink nor smell. That would be the kind of literal translation. Doesn't stink nor smell is something that we say here in Brazil. There is a sense here of the poem never being able to take a stance. It's never here nor there. It always has to be somewhere in the middle, negotiating, pleasing somebody, maybe appeasing somebody. If we want to denounce a particular kind of thing, the price of beans, for example, the ways in which agriculture is being run, slavery, histories of slavery in Brazil, or even the price of sugar as a staple item in people's pantries, that could be quite interesting to think about, that the poem in this moment in time in Brazil isn't seen as something that can take a stance. It has to be neither here nor there. It has to be somewhere in the middle. Otherwise, there might be kind of implications for the poets at hand. We have a couple of minutes. Are there any other thoughts relating to the poem?
I'm going to give people a chance to write stuff in the chat, Georgia, but one of the things that really struck me was kind of, if you're studying something that's a kind of a new language and obviously a new context here and kind of learning of Brazilian history, are there any kind of next steps or follow-ups that you could recommend? So if someone's enjoyed this poem or kind of was interested in finding out more, are there some things you could point them towards?
Yeah, absolutely. There are several things, for example, on streaming platforms or on YouTube to watch about this period in time. So for example, if you are aware of the situation in Brazil currently, the president is very much somebody that speaks about this period in time positively. And to think about, to read current events in Brazil in kind of English language media is a place where you can actually start to see the ways in which this history actually hasn't really left. It's still kind of very much the present. So looking at media, looking at YouTube, thinking about the military dictatorship is a really interesting context. And people like Ferreira Goulart will come up quite frequently, but also music. And something that I can do is share a playlist with you, and you can send to the students as well, of songs that were censored during this period that have very interesting lyrics. So you can just get them, put them on Google Translate and see if you can actually find these hidden meanings that we were trying to find today.
Fantastic. And I know actually our final session this afternoon is a French session, and I know Emily's doing a similar thing with looking at songs. So yeah, that would be a fantastic thing to share with the students. I haven't seen anything in the chat, so I'm going to say a huge thank you, Georgia. Thank you for giving up your time. Really interesting poem. Oh,
Oh, do we have a question?
Yeah, so do you have any suggested reading for doing ab initio Portuguese?
So suggested readings.
Again, I could send some stuff out with a playlist maybe, but
Yeah,
sorry,
absolutely.
if you've got some ideas now, please do share.
In terms of language, I need to think a little bit what kinds of books would be appropriate for thinking about the Portuguese language, for somebody thinking about studying Portuguese ab initio. But in terms of culturally, there are loads of things that you can look at. There are loads of interesting books being published currently that you can try to find online. There is, for example, a new translation by Daniel Han, who is a translation. I can pop his name here in the chat. He's an amazing British translator of Brazilian literature, and he has just translated a couple of books by the Brazilian writer Julian Fuchs, which has written about this period, has written about his family's history in Brazil. So that might be something interesting to look at. Another person that has been translated recently is Beatriz Bracher, which is a Brazilian writer that also writes about this period. All of these are quite accessible books, but very interesting as well. And they're very contemporary. So it might be interesting to look at them if you're interested in this period and contemporary and modern literature. And those would be quite interesting avenues to kind of getting a hang of the periods in which you kind of would be studying in Portuguese literature.